Legal questions? Ask a lawyer. Give us a call at 340-1590, 340-1590 here at the studios of WPSL. And Ask a Lawyer with your host, attorney Stuart M. Address. Welcome to the program.
Hello, good morning.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. Today we're going to try to talk to you about some interesting topics and see if we can get your passions inflamed enough to call and talk to us. But before I tell you about that little topic, we had an interesting thing occur in my office yesterday. We got a very nice check, something you always enjoy.
Okay.
We had a client who went to a nail salon, and we've heard, there are a lot of great nail salons, but we've also heard that you got to be careful that everything is clean and, first use, disposable type utensils. Well, she had a little problem there. Can't say too much about it because it's confidential.
Okay.
But
obviously something went wrong.
Something went wrong, and she ended up with several surgeries.
Wow.
So something got infected, and it got worse, and worse and worse and worse and worse. And it's now about 6-7 months later, and it's finally just beginning to heal. So we were hoping in this particular situation to try to settle it without having to go to court. And one of the reasons was she also has a diagnosis of a very aggressive cancer, and the doctors put her on the clock. Elderly lady, but not too elderly. And so I did not want her to spend the last 2 years of her life in litigation. It's just not
right.
It's not worth it, honestly. So we made an attempt to resolve it pre-suit, and we were successful. We did fairly well. She was very happy, and we got a nice check that approached 6 figures in yesterday. And when she picked it up, in addition to the thanks and all of that, and I hope things go as well as they can go for you, and last as long as you can. I mean, she's very upfront about her situation. And I said, you do with the money whatever you want to do with it. Obviously, take care of your kids, take care of your grandkids, whatever. I said, but I have no control. But do me a favor. Take some of the money, you and your husband, go on some vacation you've always dreamed of but never had the money to go. Just go, and go now. Go, enjoy it, make some memories. Let this be some real benefit to you, before you do whatever you're going to do with the rest of the money, and, probably benefit your family, after you're gone. So she left, a little bit tears on both sides. But, those are as a solo practitioner, those are the clients I enjoy working with, because you get involved with them, and I know that there is a meaning of this money to her beyond simply the dollars and cents. And there was a meaning to her of being able to resolve it without having to go into court and file a lawsuit. So it was a very nice way to close out yesterday, and that leads us into today. One day blends into another. Sometimes you don't even remember what day it is.
I do have a question on that. When you have a lawsuit like that against a business with obviously sloppy practices, is it their insurance company or is it that business who is responsible?
Typically, it's their insurance company.
Okay.
That, of course, assumes they have insurance. Usually they do.
Okay.
Not all businesses do. And it becomes much more difficult if they don't, obviously.
Okay.
But here, they did have insurance. The insurance company, these days, they're not pushovers.
No.
We had to give them a lot of documentation about her medical condition and what occurred and how it occurred. We had to pull a punch card that showed she had been there several times, because at first they were denying that she had ever gone there and this happened there.
Really?
And, I had to get her go back and do you pay by a credit card? Do you have go into your credit card receipts, even if you didn't keep one, go back into the computer. And she came up with a punch card that showed she'd been there a number of times, and so it became a little bit more difficult for them to say, this didn't happen here.
Sure.
And she had some very good details as to describing the person who was her technician.
Mm-hmm.
So that disappeared very quickly, and then it became a matter of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, we were able to resolve that. So for today, I had something planned. We were going to go back into wage and hour and overtime,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe do that next week. But I really thought that given current events, we might look at a topic of the day from a legal perspective, from a constitutional law perspective, and that is the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it is being talked about everywhere. It's nonstop on the major news networks.
Yeah, I heard on the way in, one of the schools down south is they're doing a walkout right now, and of course they're reporting traffic going, here's where they're walking, trying to stay out of the area. Yeah.
But interesting, yesterday, it was the day before, I'm sorry. You had a lot of the students from Parkland and elsewhere in Tallahassee meeting with legislators
Mm-hmm.
and with the governor.
Mm-hmm.
You had students from a number of school shootings in Washington, D.C., meeting with congressional representatives and even the president. And the question really is now, at least from what I've been hearing, is this going to be any different than any of the prior mass shootings, particularly those in schools? Is the talk that is going on now about some minor modifications of background checks and assault weapon limitations, magazine limitations, are they ever going to get done? Is there the ability?
I was under the assumption that background checks were already being done.
They are, but how much time do you have to wait? There are loopholes to the background check. There are certain places like gun shows where you don't need to do a background check. You just go in and buy the gun.
If you purchase from a dealer, there is. If you purchase
Yes.
from an owner, like say in the parking lot, of course there's not. But then gun shows don't have anything to do with that, because I could very well sell it any day of the week.
That's true, and there are exceptions written into the statute for gun shows.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of ways to get around it. The problem here, and this is my view, and that's why I'm hoping that we're going to get you folks to call and argue with me, disagree with me, agree with me. And by the way, if you want to call about something else, if you have a legal issue on your mind, feel free to call anyway. It doesn't have to be about this topic. You have a landlord-tenant situation, a small claim situation, discrimination.
Oh, landlord-tenant. That would be a good show.
It will be.
I used to be a landlord a long time ago.
I used to be a tenant. So, feel free to call about anything. You don't have to worry that we're talking a lot today about the Second Amendment and gun control. But, it seems today the question is now, what does the Second Amendment really say? What does it mean?
I have a feeling that all the marchers today don't really know what it means.
That may very well be true. Some of them do. I've heard some comments sort of explaining things that I may be saying today, maybe not in the same depth. It was interesting. One of the things I heard is that among the papers that were strewn on the ground at Parkland High School, one of the things found was a paper from a AP ethics class. An AP civics class. How does a bill become a law? Difference in congressional and executive power. Very interesting and important things to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of coincidental that you find that on the ground, and then these students are going to Tallahassee to advocate for what they believe is necessary. It is the epitome of their civics class. They should all get A's. Regardless of what happens or doesn't happen. Whoever taught them obviously did a good job at least motivating them to be interested in civics, and then obviously the tragedy may have been the spark that pushed them to do something about something. So let's talk a little bit about the history behind what led to the Second Amendment. It did come out of common law England. And in England, there was a general right to have arms that came out of the Charter of Freedoms, which we're not going to go down into all this nitty-gritty. But when we got over into the colonies, it became the obligation of men to keep watch and ward at night, to confront and capture suspicious persons. Why? There really was no official federal army.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been a constable, in big towns, but there was no police force. In many places, the constable or the sheriff didn't even have a weapon. And so, in order to protect the cities, the towns, whatever, you had what? You had local militias.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the militias, people needed to have guns. Back then, perhaps they were muskets, but we'll just call them guns.
Times change.
That's right. And so, when we started the Revolutionary War, who was fighting? Well, Congress, not the Continental Congress, established the Continental Army, which was a federal army. We also had the French army fighting on our behalf. And we had various state and regional militias that were created. Those people, by the way, had to have their own guns. They were not provided by the militias.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this debate over when the Constitution was passed, and then there was discussion of, well, we need a Bill of Rights. And of course, the right to bear arms comes very close. It's in the Second Amendment. There's a lot of discussion about, well, what was the purpose of it? And I won't even say historians disagree. The people of the time disagreed. They had different theories about why we needed something that dealt with the right of people to have guns and to bear arms. You have one historian whose name is Jack Rakov, and he suggested that Madison's intention in framing the Second Amendment was to provide assurances to the anti-federalists, the people who did not want all power to be in the federal government. They didn't want the federal government to be able to come in and take them over because they had no arms and no guns to protect themselves. That militias would not be disarmed. That was a concern. So when we had the passage of the Second Amendment, that Second Amendment itself was relatively uncontroversial. It was well accepted that people had the right to have guns. And one of the delegates from Pennsylvania, a guy by the name of Robert Whitehall, he sought to clarify a draft of the Constitution with a Bill of Rights. And in that Bill of Rights, obviously, was a Second Amendment. Now, what does it really say? We hear so much about the Second Amendment provides for the right to bear arms. It shall not be abridged, it shall not be violated, et cetera, et cetera. It's not what it says. And a lot of people who make the argument, the gun control argument, talk about what it really says. Now, we'll talk about what it says, but then the question is, what does it mean? And in law, that's the real key. Mm-hmm. You look at what something says, and then you got to figure out what it really means. And there are a lot of ways to do that. What it says is Article 1, Section 8, Clause, well, this is before the Second Amendment. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16 of the Constitution talks about the reason that led into the Second Amendment. And it says, and I'm quoting, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So here you have in Article 1 of the Constitution talking about the necessity of militias, which of course leads to the right to have guns. Now, in 1792, Congress passed a statute that provided for the national defense, and it established a uniform militia throughout the United States. And it's interesting what it says. Each and every free, able-bodied white male, okay, we all know about that, white male citizen of the respective states, resident therein, who is or shall be of the age of 18 years and under the age of 45, shall severally and respectively be enrolled in the militia. So back then, you were automatically in the militia. And every citizen so enrolled and notified shall within 6 months thereafter provide himself with a good musket or firelock, a sufficient bayonet and belt, 2 spare flints, and a knapsack, a pouch with a box therein to contain not less than 24 cartridges, suited to the bore of his musket or firelock, each cartridge to contain a proper quantity of powder and ball, or with a good rifle, knapsack, shot pouch, and powder horn, 20 balls suited to the bore of his rifle, and 1/4 pound of powder, and shall appear so armed when called out to exercise into the service. And that was the purpose of what led to the Second Amendment. The act that we just talked about gave very specific instructions to weapons manufacturers as to how to manufacture the weapons. And in part, it said that weapons manufacturers, after 5 years from the passing of this act, muskets for arming the militia as herein required, shall be free of bores sufficient for balls of the 18th part of a pound. Very specific. So, there are 3 theories that deal with the Second Amendment as to what it really meant and what the framers had in mind, because they didn't all agree. The first is a states' rights theory. And the states' rights theory holds that the Second Amendment doesn't apply to individuals. It, however, recognizes the right of each state to arm its militia. So it's not an individual right to bear arms, it's a state right to provide for militias and the individuals.
And that's how we get the differences even today from state to state, like Texas.
That's correct. That's great. Now, the second theory is called a sophisticated collective rights model. Okay? It's a little different. It held that the Second Amendment recognized some limited individual rights to bear arms. However, the individual right could only be exercised by participating members of a functioning, organized state militia. So still it dealt with militias. But here you have an individual right, whereas in the first theory, the states' rights model, it's the state right, not the individual. And then you have the third theory, which is called the standard model, which held that the Second Amendment recognized the personal right of individuals to keep and bear arms. Supporters of that model argued that although the first clause, which we're going to get to in the Second Amendment, may describe a general purpose, the militias, the second clause is controlling, and therefore the amendment confers an individual right to the people to keep and bear arms. It's the more modern day theory that when you're looking at court decisions, is what's used.
There's more and more and more and more people.
That's true, and there is more and more and more types of weapons. Okay, I personally find it interesting that so far all we've talked about are militias, muskets, balls of grain, bayonets, things like that.
Oh, but they're illegal. Bayonets today are illegal.
All right, so then we get a lot of Supreme Court decisions, and we even have some Circuit Court decisions that are relevant. There's some splits in the circuit courts on individual rights versus state rights. But the Second Amendment itself, my goodness, where did I have that? This is what happens on live radio. My goodness. Well, I tell you what, I am going to keep talking, and I'm going to pull it up right here. It'll only take a couple seconds. And I'm sure if I just put in, my goodness, Second Amendment, we're going to get it in about...
And I'll remind everyone, if they want to give us a call, 340-1590, 340-1590 here in the studios. It's Ask a Lawyer on WPSL. And, of course, any question, you can call in and ask us.
I have to assume not everybody's agreeing. All right, here is what the amendment...
maybe they're listening because they don't really know all of this.
I hope so, but I hope to hear from them as well. The Second Amendment actually says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay? Now, some say that first part, well-regulated militia, is an introductory clause that is describing a purpose for the individual right to keep and bear arms. Others say that is not just an introductory clause, it is the explanation for the purpose of the Second Amendment. So now that leads you into what can the courts do in terms of regulating the right to bear arms, because the Second Amendment says it shall not be infringed. So what can the courts do? So we have an argument about regulated, disciplined, trained, and in District of Columbia versus Heller, a decision of the Supreme Court not too long ago, actually. It's talked about quite regularly on the news when we're discussing these issues. It's a 2008 decision. The Supreme Court stated that, quote, the adjective well-regulated implies nothing more than the imposition of proper discipline and training, end quote. Well, proper discipline and training for what? If an individual has an unfettered right to go get a gun, what is the discipline and training? Is it that he has to take a class, or she, to learn how to utilize that firearm? Or does proper discipline and training refer to a militia? So we go, I back in, 83, we're going way back now. When I was at Rutgers University as an undergrad, I was a teaching assistant. I was a hotshot, maybe the only time. I was a teaching assistant in Political Science 101. And I had, a section that I met with once a week after they listened to the professor, in a setting of like 300 students. So generally the sections were designed for you to really be able to ask questions. And one of the things we went over the Federalist Papers. We went over, it looks like we have a question, so I will stop in mid-sentence, because the questions are much more important.
So we're going to go line 1.
Okay, with line 1, I think, oh my good, hello, Bulldog.
Hey, how are you?
Are you my groupie?
Hey, I'm trying to,
He's our designated caller.
Everybody's mind by asking you questions.
All right, Bulldog, shoot. I didn't read
really
that literally.
Hey,
Bump.
trust me, I could. But see, that leads to my point. A well-armed militia doesn't necessarily have to be still in the military, barring PTSD and things like that. But what I'm saying is that a lot of us, if, we had rolled the clock back to when I got out of the military, and I used the GI Bill and everything, I could have used a part-time job running, security on schools.
Okay.
And I'm sure that there's probably a lot of people getting out of the military that could do that as well. So maybe, that is a possible scenario for that.
That may very well be. It's certainly a legitimate purpose.
But the school system will come back and say there's no money.
Well, maybe he'd be hired part-time as a civilian employee of the Sheriff's Department, and hopefully, Bulldog, if that was the situation, you would have gone into the building.
Well, no, and absolutely, we run towards, not from.
Yeah, but see, this person should actually be in the building already, and there should really only be one way for visitors to come in.
It's a big high school, and the school resource officer roams. I can understand him not being in the building. But I do agree with Bulldog. In the Las Vegas situation, you saw lots of people running towards the gunfire.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Going into danger to try to protect others. And they were law enforcement and they were ordinary citizens. Go ahead, Bulldog.
Now, and I'll give you one other point that I should say, is that AR-15s, they shouldn't be banned, but you should be specially qualified.
Well, let me ask you, Bulldog, why do you say that? Why should anybody have the right, as a civilian, to have an assault-style weapon? What possible purpose could it serve?
Well, I shoot expert with it, so, as the M16, and I'm familiar with it, and so for me it's a, semi-comfortable weapon. I know how to use it, and I know how to maintain it.
And I have no doubt about that, but why should you have the right to have a weapon like that?
I still say that.
But it's really just a rifle.
Really?
Where a shotgun would actually hit more people per shot.
Oh, excuse me. Hey, everybody leaves out the AK-47. Hello.
I agree. My point goes really, frankly, to all of them. I mean, I obviously have my opinion is that I understand the argument with firearms. I understand the argument about self-defense and hunting and things like that. And absolutely, I believe the Second Amendment covers that. But I do not understand why any citizen should have the right to have an assault weapon, an Uzi, whether you want to call it an AK-47 or whatever. And I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with guns, but I disagree fundamentally, particularly based upon the history and that we'll continue to go through, as to where the legal right comes from to have a weapon of that nature to a civilian.
Right, and so what we're going to do
to form a militia.
Well, no,
we don't need militias anymore. That's the point.
But okay, let's look at Syria. Syria, you see those poor children who were poisoned, laying there dying. If their citizens had the right to own weapons, they could rise up against the government that's killing them.
They're going to have whatever constitution they have in Syria. We have our own constitution, and except for some extremists, nobody really questions whether or not the government, the federal government, is going to come, and destroy you. Okay. The argument that we need to protect ourselves from the government and we need to have the ability to have an insurrection, that is not part of our rule of law. Those issues and those disputes are supposed to go through the courts. That's the way we set up our Constitution. And so back in the day when the Second Amendment was passed, and the days of muskets and all that nature, and where there weren't local police forces and we needed the citizens to be armed and to be skilled, whether it was, some bank robber that was coming through town.
Okay, but you know what they say. They always say, when seconds count, the police are minutes away.
That's true. But what does that have to do with an assault weapon?
To me, it's just a rifle.
Well, to me, there are 8 million of them in the United States.
What would happen if there were zero?
People would still die this weekend in Chicago.
Okay. They would, but would as many people die over the course of a year?
What are you going to do?
I think they would.
Knock on my,
well,
I do.
Let's look at Japan. Let's look at Australia.
Because really, what we're doing is we're making legitimate people more legitimate, or making it more difficult for legitimate people, because the bad guys always get what they want.
Do you know there's a school teacher, I forget where, I just read it last night, who accidentally shot herself in the foot at school?
She probably shouldn't have been handling a gun.
She was licensed.
But that doesn't mean she has any skills.
Anyway, let Bulldog finish his point, and I appreciate your point of view and the call. So let me get you. I mean, obviously you still have something to say, and let me let you do that.
Oh no, I'm finished. I'm
all right.
saying
I think we have another call behind you.
No, we he dropped off.
Unfortunately, okay.
All right, thank you.
You're very welcome, Bulldog. Thanks very much.
But if Vince wants to give us a call back, 340-1590, phone lines are open, and anyone else who wants to either change the subject or continue the subject is welcome to call in.
Well, all right. So we were talking about the nitty-gritty, which we won't spend too much time on because it could bore a lot of people, but the Federalist Papers and Democracy in America by a French philosopher, Alexis de Tocqueville, which is what I taught in my section, and all about revolution and how the development of our Constitution came about. Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers, number 29, about organizing and disciplining and arming and training the militia. And he said, quote, "Little more can reasonably be aimed at with respect to the people at large than to have them properly armed and equipped, and in order to see that this is not neglected, it will be necessary to assemble them once or twice in the course of a year." So that's training to make sure your little militia doesn't just show up and can't shoot straight. All right? So
right.
we'll still...
Well, it's a similar model, you might say, in Israel.
I just saw a whole big thing about Israel.
I mean, everyone serves and everyone learns.
That's true, but it's nowhere near a similar model.
Okay.
There was an interesting thing in the Jerusalem Post earlier this week about the argument that some Americans are making because they see these lovely women with these, I don't know if it's an AK-47, whatever their model is, strung over their back at a McDonald's. Look at this. Everybody walks around with these big weapons. And I remember decades ago when my parents first went to Israel and they saw they landed in the airport, way back then, guns, not just guns, these rifles, these, over the backs of all the military that are standing there.
Well, that happened to me. I had no idea. We flew from Florida to Jamaica. We're going to party in the sunshine. And what we were met when we got off the airplane, I mean, we're stepping down the steps and here comes the Jeep full of men with machine guns.
The point that Jerusalem Post made was in Israel, there are very, very severe restrictions on who can have a weapon and how many. All right. If you are serving in the military or you're retired, you may have a weapon. If you're in law enforcement, you may have a weapon. If you live on a kibbutz, you may have a weapon. If you live in the West Bank, you may have a weapon. The rest of the citizens of Israel have to go through an extraordinary application process, background checks, including psychological and criminal. And if they are approved for a weapon, and I believe it said there were only 40,000 such weapons in all of Israel, you can only have one gun per person. And then it was prescribed how you had to keep it, how you had to take care of it, and how often you had to bring it to a central authority to examine it and to make sure that the weapon was in good condition and that you knew how to use it. It is not the same model in Israel, not by any stretch of the imagination. And the people who may look at pictures of plain clothes, women or guys in shorts and a T-shirt with this giant gun over their back, they are in training for the military. This is their off-duty time, and they are required to have that weapon strewn over their back. And at least according to the article, they don't enjoy it because it's heavy. So, there are a lot of countries that have slightly different laws and setups of their constitution, and that's legitimate. But in Australia and Japan, where they have extremely severe gun control regulations, the amount of deaths by gun are so low as to defy argument that gun control does not work.
We'd also have to look, though, at whatever their crime rate is just in general, because let's again look at Chicago.
And people have done that.
The crime rate is crazy in a city like Chicago or Detroit.
And people have looked, I don't know about Japan actually, but in Australia, as to what the rate of injury or death from firearms was before all these severe regulations went into effect. And then what happened in the 5-10 years after that. And, okay, it's only one country, but there's no question in Australia that the gun control regulations led to a decrease in deaths and a decrease in shootings. So I'm sorry, I understand the argument for folks that say, guns don't kill people, people do. I'm sorry, people that have guns kill people. And if you restrict the access of certain types of weapons, I think, look, somebody from the NRA might call. Go ahead, please do. And say, oh, no. You can't tell me that would have prevented Parkland. You're right. I can't. But it might have prevented Sandy Hook. Or it might have prevented Columbine. or it might have prevented the one next week. Can anybody say that any regulation, short of taking everybody's guns, can stop this? No. But come on, it's going to stop a lot of it if it's harder for an 18-year-old with some mental issues to get a weapon like this and to just saunter into the high school and start shooting. If it was harder for the Las Vegas shooter to get these bump stocks to make it as if it was an automatic weapon, just spraying bullets everywhere. That's the point. And that's the point where the NRA is a lobbying organization. And, I don't blame the NRA, frankly. They do what they are supposed to do. They are a lobbying group. And they are probably
the Sandy Hook shooter and the shooter just recently and the Las Vegas shooter, probably none of them are NRA members.
No, probably not. They're a little bit, I hate the generic word, but crazy. The NRA is a lobbying organization, probably the most effective one in the country. Okay, they spend a lot of money. It's unfortunate, in my personal opinion as a lawyer, that kind of money buys that kind of influence, and that it prevents even rational gun control regulation. But, it's really not the NRA's fault that they're so powerful. It's the fault of the legislators who feel compelled to watch how they vote so that they don't lose the donations. It may be that these kids, and I use the word loosely, these high school students, they're on the verge, many of them, of being able to vote. Maybe they're going to start voting people out. Maybe they're going to start running for office. Just like we now have a lot more women running for office and winning elected office and winning congressional seats. Maybe these students are going to start doing it, and in 5 years, we'll have a whole different composition of federal legislators who are not in order to the NRA and will do what they think needs to be done.
Sadly, though, looking back and looking at Congress and the Senate, those are some old faces that we see.
Yes, and a lot of them are not running anymore.
They've been sitting in their seats for the entire time I've been alive.
You're right. A lot of them have decided
young.
not to run again. Okay?
Yeah.
The only quarrel I really have with the NRA is that as a governing body, it's not listening to its own members. When the polls of its own members go through, you see about 80% of them agree that there are certain rational restrictions that are appropriate. But the governing body has a charge. The charge is prevent any modification, any restrictions in guns. And they fulfill their obligation very well. Okay? But, getting into some of the more recent cases, so I can at least try to finish this, because we're not going to do this every show, obviously. In the types of weapons, there was a case, the Heller case, that came back to the court on a further appeal. It talked about clarifying the scope of permissible restrictions. And it said that the firearms registration procedures, the prohibition on assault weapons, and the prohibition on large capacity ammunition feeding devices were found not to violate the Second Amendment. That's the Supreme Court in 2008. So if a prohibition on assault weapons and large capacity ammunition does not violate the Second Amendment according to the Supreme Court, then where's the legislation that implements that decision and makes it law? Because the Supreme Court can say it, but that doesn't mean it has to be a law. It just says the Second Amendment doesn't prohibit it. If it's going to be a law, the legislature has to pass it. So where is it? And why do we continue to have people going on MSNBC and CNN and Fox and everywhere else saying that you can't prohibit assault weapons? You can't prohibit large magazines.
But we did for a while, didn't we? Wasn't there a...
Yes, and then it was loosened up, and I don't know the entire history, honestly, of the statutory scheme, but yes, for a while we did. It's interesting also, one of the first Supreme Court decisions.
Now, is that a state-by-state decision as well?
In a way, yes, as long as it's not inconsistent with a federal scheme.
Okay.
States have the right to regulate, for the most part, anything that is not reserved exclusively for regulation by the federal government. So a state cannot decide we're going to have diplomatic relations with Iran. That is for the federal government to decide. New Jersey can't decide we're going to war with North Korea. That is for the federal government. It's right there in the Constitution, enumerated powers. And it's interesting. There are certain enumerated powers in the Constitution. And then the Constitution says, and all powers not so enumerated are reserved to the states. And that is the essence of our government. We are not really a democracy. We're not a pure democracy. We're a republic. States have rights far beyond really what the federal government has. They control a lot more of our lives than do the federal government. However, there are some very significant areas where the federal government controls because it was determined that either we need one voice for the nation or because the Constitution explicitly reserves those rights to the state. In the very first Supreme Court case that dealt with the Second Amendment, at least in the 20th century, United States versus Miller, a 1939 decision from the Supreme Court. It said that the Second Amendment did not protect weapon types, quote, not having a reasonable relationship to the preservation of efficiency of a well-regulated militia, end quote. Again, going back to what the first sentence or clause of the Second Amendment actually says. We can go into it, explained why, but I'm afraid we would actually run out of time. There's a much more recent Supreme Court decision that deals with assault weapons. There are actually four circuit court cases, federal circuit court cases recently, that deal with assault weapons, since that's the key issue that's being discussed right now. One comes out of the Fourth Circuit called Colby versus Hogan, and the court ruled that the ban on assault weapons, like the ones used at Sandy Hook, and the ones that the individual confessed to using at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and that Omar Martin used at Orlando's Pulse nightclub, and that Stephen Paddock used at Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, they determined that the ban on those types of assault weapons was constitutional. It's a recent Fourth Circuit case. And the court said, put simply, we have no power to extend the Second Amendment protection to weapons of war that the Heller decision excluded from such coverage. Okay? The second one is what's referred to as Heller 2. Sometimes a case comes back. And Heller 2 was in the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia. Okay, Supreme Court sends part of the case back to the Circuit Court, gives it instructions as how to handle something, and then the Circuit Court has to make its own decision all over again. And in that case, in Heller 2, the Circuit Court for the D.C. Circuit upheld a ban on assault weapons and large capacity magazines in Washington. And the appeals court said in its 2011 decision that the ban didn't impinge on an individual's right to self-defense. It said that the city had plenty of reasons to believe that assault weapons were too dangerous in self-defense situations. And with the ability to fire so many shots so rapidly, the judges said, such weapons pose, quote-unquote, grave risks to bystanders, not to mention police officers who might confront them on the streets, not to mention the deputy, the school resource officer, who chose not to enter the high school and indicated he was concerned about what would happen if he confronted the shooter with an assault weapon with only his handgun. And of course, I can understand, I really can understand his fear, but being in the position he is in, he should have entered.
He's a deputy from the sheriff's department.
Right.
Did he radio? Was he under
I don't
instructions?
know.
We don't know what.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a caller. We have Pat on line one. Go ahead, Pat.
Hey, have you been getting a lot of calls this morning?
We've gotten a few. I'd always like to get more.
I just walked in. That's why I'm asking. Did I hear you say, and I had to get my dogs out, as I was taking them out, I thought I heard you say the NRA, something about their branch of government?
No, they're not a branch of government.
I know that.
They're a lobbying entity. They're a lobbying group.
Correct. I understand that. And would you please define an assault weapon? Or have you had that question?
Well, no, I haven't had that question, and I actually can't define it because I'm not a gun enthusiast that could capably define it. And I also think that how it is defined will be dependent upon legislation. So there are people, perhaps you, who may know and have better arguments as to what an assault weapon is. All I know is when I hear of these shootings and I hear of weapons being used that can fire lots of bullets in a short period of time, to me that's an assault weapon.
Okay, so you don't believe just because it has something to hang on to at the front of the barrel, where you got a grip like a motorcycle rider would have, a grip and a clip in it, it's an assault weapon.
Now, my understanding, and again, it's not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that a weapon where you have to pull the trigger for every shot is permissible.
Yeah, but you can't buy it.
That's exactly what every one of these assault weapons were.
You can't buy it any other way.
Well, then, that's firstly, it's not the way it happened in Las Vegas with the bump shots.
That is correct.
Circumvented that.
Right,
That is
and
correct.
that should definitely be illegal.
And then there are automatic weapons, there are semi-automatic weapons.
The guy in Las Vegas, I'm just glad he didn't being how he was a pilot, I'm glad he just didn't take one of his planes and bring it down, because it would have taken out everything.
Well, that's
and then
true,
we'd
too.
be talking about airplanes.
Well, that's right. And, unfortunately, the way we seem to work things is we wait for our disaster to happen, and then we look how to prevent that disaster from
I always say
happening again.
I want a ban on bad people.
Yeah, but what's sad about this thing down south here is that kid never had a snowball's chance in hell. He was adopted as a baby.
But that doesn't give you.
Adopted dad dies when he's 4.
Pat, we can separate, I think, sympathy and compassion for anybody who commits a crime.
I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering how many kids in school ever walked up to him and said, "Hey, buddy, how you doing today?" Instead of, "Damn, you're weird."
Well, you're right, and that may be a form of bullying, or it may be a form of ostracizing. And you're right; those go on in schools every day, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, but they're saying that this kid was holding a gun to his mother's head back before she died, and his little brother, and this kid is definitely has some problem.
Right,
Yes.
but I certainly don't believe, in my opinion, that any of those situations, any of those backgrounds, as unfortunate as they may be, justify either the shooting or the ability to get a hold of a weapon that can fire very quickly.
I'm just glad he didn't take hand grenades or something like that.
Oh, yes. We have Vince on line 2. Thank you for calling, Pat. He had tried to call before, so I want to get to him, okay?
Go ahead, Vince. You're on the air.
Hey, Vince, how are you?
Hi, am I speaking to the WPSL show?
Yes, you
Yeah.
are.
Attorney?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
I'm Stuart Address.
Okay, great. I called earlier and something got mixed up. But anyway, when you were describing or quoting the Second Amendment, I think what was inherent in that clause is the definition of a militia,
That's correct.
which is just the private citizens of a group. So, my contention is that if the states have a right to form the militia, then the citizens who would be members of that militia have a right to bear arms.
Well, right. If the state is going to form the militia, then certainly they can prescribe the rights of those individuals who are part of the militia. But when you look to define militia as well, we need to look back to what was a militia and what was its purpose. Its purpose was to provide defense in a locality where there wasn't a police force and the one or two law enforcement officers may not even have had weapons. That was the purpose initially of a militia, and what led to that word being utilized in the Second Amendment.
Well, the militia is on the ready, okay, to be, it's the public to be ready to defend their country or their county or whatever it is. And if they don't have guns at their homes, how are they going to be ready?
Vince, we no longer need militias. We don't use militias. We have a National Guard, which is state-operated, okay, under federal authority. We have the Army, the Navy, the Marine Force, the Air Force.
But who is the bad guy at the time? You just really don't know who the bad guy might be.
But my
at the
point
time.
is we have now nationalized and state and local law enforcement that are fully equipped to repel. It is not necessary for citizens to form a militia. In fact,
you make a good point.
In fact, thank you.
Unless those very people end up being the bad guy.
Well, in fact, one of the teachers at Marjory Stoneman, in response to President Trump's suggestion that maybe we can get 20% of the teachers who want it, to have guns, said, I don't want a gun, because when the police show up and I'm holding a gun, how do they know I'm not the shooter? I don't know that I would want to be in that situation where all of a sudden legitimate law enforcement shows up and I have a weapon in my hand. You still there, Vince? Or okay, we answered his question. So, as we really close down the show now, we have a couple other decisions. There have been circuit courts that talk about the types of wounds that are likely from certain weapons. They talk about semi-automatic assault weapons, large-capacity magazines. One court in the Second Circuit from New York said that semi-automatic weapons have been understood to pose unusual risks, resulting in more numerous wounds, more serious wounds, and more victims. And interestingly, these recent circuit court cases, the Supreme Court has declined to review since the Heller decision. So in my view, my point here is that there is an ability for the states and the federal government to have reasonable restrictions on the right to have guns. And to me, I define that as, automatic, semi-automatic, assault style, large capacity. That in no way am I arguing personally that the individual's right to have a gun should be infringed. I honestly don't think very many people are arguing that, no matter what is said. I'm not arguing that a hunter should not be able to have an appropriate rifle to go hunting. I'm not saying that people who like to go target shooting, skeet shooting, or whatever shouldn't have the weapons that are needed to be able to do things like that. All I'm saying is we have had way too many mass shootings in this country over the last several years. We have had congressional representatives shot at a baseball field for a softball game. We have school shootings, it seems, every single week. And
it's a form of sport in Chicago over every weekend.
Yeah, and I think these students, mostly students that are now rising up in Florida and elsewhere to try to advocate for change, have a very good point, a valid point. And if the restrictions are narrowed and they're reasonable and they're consistent with the Supreme Court, promulgations and concerns and rationale, then this should not be such a serious issue as to incur the wrath of the NRA, particularly when the average member of the NRA agrees with at least some of these types of restrictions. Anyway, folks, that is going to do it for today. I am Stuart Address. My office is in Stuart, Florida, and you can check us out at www.stuartaddresslaw.com. Go ahead, check us out, give us a call. If you have a legal question, either call here on Fridays at 10:05 for Ask a Lawyer, or call my office at 781-8003.
See you next week.
See you next week.
This is WPSL Port St. Lucie.